Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for Leadership Connect's panel discussion on synergies in tribal, state, and local relations, fostering cooperation for inclusive governance. We're excited to delve into this important issue as our panelists offer some valuable insights into the best practices in tribal relations, contemporary issues, and potential paths forward. I'm Victoria Hodge, the product manager here at Leadership Connect, focused on our federal policy and our new tribal nation data, which aims to foster greater connection and collaboration between tribal nations and the public and private sectors. I'm joined by an excellent group of panelists. We have Burke Thompson from the Orphan Oil and Well Program Manager for Kiowa Tribe, Naomi Miguel, who's the Executive Director for the White House Initiative for Native Americans in Tribal Colleges and Universities, Dustin Jansen, the Utah Division Director for Indian Affairs, and Sean Howard, the co-founder and president for Core Strategic Management. We're going to start off with a poll question for some of our audience members to join in on. So this question is, what are the biggest challenges facing tribal affairs professionals? Is it economic development, community engagement, or political advocacy issues? And for our panelists, let's start off by you telling us a little bit more about yourselves. So how did you all enter this field of tribal and indigenous affairs? How does the work you all are doing today make an impact on this space? And why is this so important? Let's start with Naomi.
Skugambijak Aniabjigik Naomi Miguel como Amajuk Chichu Sufoitak Jukshan Thanaat the Nation. Good afternoon, my name is Naomi Miguel. I'm from the Thanaat the Nation in southern Arizona. And my interest in tribal affairs began as an undergrad. During my political science studies, I noticed there wasn't a lot of information about tribal communities or data. And around that time, I received information about American University's Washington Internship for Native Students program, or WINS program. And I applied for the program as a junior and senior in undergrad and was able to intern at the Federal Communications Commission's Intergovernmental Affairs Office and the National Science Foundation's Office of Investigative General or Inspector General. And through those internships, I saw how the federal government's actions impacted tribal communities and really saw that we need more federal employees with tribal lived experiences in our federal agencies. And that really led me to start thinking more about the intergovernmental aspect of tribal and federal affairs. So the work that I'm doing right now with the White House Initiative impacts Indian education, and the work of the White House Initiative is important because we have a mandate through the executive order to work and ensure that our Native students have educational equity and inclusion throughout our students' lives. That's it.
Thank you, Naomi. Burke, tell us more about the work you do and how you got involved in this.
Yes, ma'am. I've been working in the oil and natural gas industry for the past 39 years in one capacity or another. For reference, we like to say that it's a white workforce that I've been in. It's non-tribal. I haven't had any tribal involvement until November of this past year. I started a career with ONEOK, which is a very large company here in Oklahoma. I did 25 years with them to start my career, made a transition into the petroleum crude oil side of things and hazmat transportation, did the remainder of my time there before I came to the Kiowa tribe. There was a need for a management of the orphan oil and gas wells program here, and I felt like I could give back to the tribe. That my father and mother were both civil service employees, both worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And I never have really done anything to benefit any tribes with any of my expertise or really given back. So I was compelled to do that since my parents are both passed on. My father being a proud Kiowa, I felt it was time for me to try to make a difference and an impact with this program. The impact that it's going to have on reduction of methane emissions is very important. I think we all realize the climate change that we're going through. all the way across the United States of America. And volatile organic compounds and emissions have a lot to do with that. So I want to leave this place better than it was whenever I came here, and I know that's not possible, being born in the mid-60s. There's been a lot of change from then till now, but if I can help try to repair some of the damage that's been done, leave this place better for my granddaughter and her offspring, that is my wish.
Thank you, Burke. That's inspiring. Sean, I know you work in a similar industry of energy. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work you've done in Indigenous affairs as well?
Sure. So yeah, and thanks for using that language as well, because there is a difference in how it's referred to in Canada versus the US. So appreciate you flagging that for everybody. I've spent 25 years working in external relations, community engagement. The last 6 years, I'd spent working for a pipeline company on the construction side, actually doing some of the maintenance work, maintenance programs. And that's where I got a lot of my direct experience negotiating business relationships with Indigenous companies, so that in certain parts of the company, it was 100% Indigenous contractor led. But my background in this goes back to, the late 90s, doing public consultation and engagement with Indigenous bands around major project sites, and also around existing operations. It's an area that over the course of my career, I felt pulled towards. It's kind of hard to explain or put an exact finger on it, but it's an area where, as I began to increase my interactions and also increase my education and awareness, began to see, as Naomi talked about, a lot of the shortcomings and a lot of the things that we haven't been taught, and a lot of the things that we're not aware of because it's been swept under the rug. And so I've tried to use what I can in business to go around government and some of those approvals, if you will, to actually deliver impact, whether it's Indigenous contracting, looking for labor opportunities, things like that.
Thank you, Sean. And Dustin, can you tell us more about the work you do as well? And I know it goes across education to work in the state government, so I'm excited to hear more about it.
Yeah, well, hello, Nyate. My name's Dustin Jansen. I'm enrolled Navajo, also Ute and Kiowa also, but I've been in tribal government for a little bit now. I started off just going to law school, right? I went to law school and with the encouragement to serve my people, and I think a lot of Native kids when they graduate high school, they're told go to college, come back and work and serve. And so that was pretty ingrained in my head. And it's something, and I tried it. It's good. While I was in law school, I was asked to be a tribal court judge for a local tribe here. And it was a good experience for me. I ended up doing that for about 6.5 years. And I picked it up again back in 2018 and doing that since. But I also worked when I went back to work at the Navajo Nation, I worked in their legislative council. I just drafted bills. Navajo Nation's a pretty big government. They have a legislative branch, an executive branch, judicial branch, and separation of powers. And so I worked with the legislative branch for a little bit, and then I was transferred over to the Navajo Nation Department of Justice, and I did water rights litigation for a bit. My wife and I, though, decided to expand our family and we adopted some kids, and we ended up having to move to Albuquerque to find a house big enough for us and the kids to pass our home study. And so we started, I did personal injury and picked up tribal contracts as a pro tem judge, as an administrative judge, and really just helping people with adoptions. I like doing adoptions and helping people with those things. But my wife is from Utah. She's Sioux Assiniboine, but she was raised in Utah in a really small area called Camas, and so I could tell she was getting homesick, and so I looked for work back in Utah and was able to get hired at Utah Valley University and as an American Indian Studies professor, and that was just it was a good thing for me. I really enjoy teaching and I enjoy sharing things with people and educating a lot non-Indians, especially about tribal government and the relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government. A little bit after that, so I started that in 2015. In 2020, I was asked to serve as the director for the Utah Division of Indian Affairs, where I get to work with the governor and lieutenant governor and just their relationship with tribe. That we have 8 sovereign nations in our state, and so just repairing relationships. The former Governor Herbert, he took me aside and said, "Hey, Dusty, things were said, mistakes were made, and we need to make things better. Can you help us do that?" And I thought that was, those are some good objectives that I could help with, and so I said yes, and I've been doing that since, and I've had the privilege of working with Larry Echohawk, who serves as a special advisor to the Attorney General and Governor here, and so I feel like I get to learn a lot. I feel like I get to meet the tribes on a more regular basis and understand their issues and understand the help and aid that they need, whatever that may be. And it's been a blessing these last few years to do that and to be able to take part in those discussions.
Thank you, Dustin. One thing I'm just so inspired about this panel is the wealth of experience that reaches across so many different parts of the tribal affairs space. So today is just going to be an exciting discussion. And we have the results back from that first poll about the biggest challenges facing tribal affairs professionals. And it looks almost split down the board between economic development at 36%, community engagement at 28%, and political advocacy issues at 36%. So it's almost a split decision there. And so I'd love for our panelists to give their take on this. So what do you feel are some of the main issues impacting the tribal affairs space, and how have you gone about trying to solve for those? Burke, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, ma'am. Bureaucracy is a problem with all tribal governments. And a lot of times it has to be handled with kid gloves because you can break your plate per se with somebody real quick, or make a decision or a statement that could be career ending. So, with us, you really have to make a more or less a strategic plan about how you're going to go about visiting with people to deal with problems or needs. And I'm having to learn that side of tribal government as I go, because like I said, I'm not used to that. But I would say that to deal with the bureaucracy involved with our daily operations and needs, to be able to facilitate needs in a transparent, quick fashion is the way to success whenever it comes to tribal government against personal business or the corporate world, and I feel like once I'm able to get my hands around that process, it's going to really help me succeed. Because the turnaround on requests in tribal government tends to be a lot longer than you would want it to be. And I'd like to get it to be where if I have a request at 8 o'clock in the morning, I put the business to bed by 3 in the afternoon. I'm a long ways from that right now. And like I said, addressing these problems, it has to be done with kid gloves. Just like I said, you have to make sure that you're not stepping on somebody's toes inadvertently, because everybody lives in their own world whenever it comes to what's requested of them. And anyway, just dealing with that has been my challenge, and I'm learning it as I go.
Definitely, it's a learning process, and being aware of all the cultural differences between each tribe is a learning process for everyone.
Yes,
Naomi, what do you feel are some of the major challenges facing the space, and how have you worked to overcome them?
I think for the White House Initiative's perspective, a statistic that we always like to start with is usually that 93% of our American Indian Alaska Native students are in public schools, yet we're 2 times more likely to drop out of school. So our challenge is really ensuring that education equity for our Native students in non-Native spaces includes that inclusiveness and education of non-Native educators of the importance of culture in classrooms, but also including safety for our Native students in these classrooms. A lot of folks may think that our Native students are only on tribal lands, but because of past the history of the federal government trying to relocate tribal families away from tribal lands, there are major cities that have a really big population of Native Americans in there. So during the Relocation Act, I think it was back in like the 70s, the major cities like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Albuquerque became these hubs outside of tribal lands. So we ended up having urban Indian communities, and that's where also some of our public school students attend. So that that kind of education of making sure our educators at the state and local levels understand that they have an obligation to provide quality education for our Native students and inclusive education to our students is something that is a challenge. But that is something that the White House Initiative is tasked to start helping and alleviate a lot of that with making the connections among our tribal educators, our state educators, and our local educators.
There's a lot of synergy that has to happen there between all those different groups, but it's exciting to see that progress is being made. Dustin, in your experience, what do you find are some of the biggest challenges facing the space, and what have you done to try to alleviate some of those?
I think one of the biggest things we do is just try to educate. It's hard to, there are a lot of, especially non-Indians and non-Indians in government, they tend to see natives or the Indian as a racial status, and they want to control it as they do other things that are in the racial realms. But Indian's a legal status. It's a political status that, and you know, they're citizens of sovereign nations, and the work that we're doing is government to government. It isn't government with a group of people from a certain racial community. It's one government working with another government and teaching state agencies and even state higher ups that to approach it that way. That gets difficult. Also, that I mean, we only have 8 tribes in Utah, but understanding that these 8 tribes are different. We have some tribes that are very environmentally aware, and we have some tribes that are we'll just call them energy tribes, right? They're tribes that extract and drill, and that's how they make their money. That's their economy, and that's how they provide for their people. And so to get non-Indian politicals on that same wavelength, that can be hard sometimes. I think also just learning providing some cultural understanding for people. If you haven't grown up in an Indian community, you can probably come off wrong, even if you're trying to be polite, and you can burn some bridges that way. So we do a little bit of cultural education too, and that seems to help. You know, I can give an example that we're having reporting. We had the state agencies and the governor and the tribes come up, and they're just reporting back and forth at the things they were working on. And we gave them time limits. We said it out loud, right? You have 20 minutes to do this and 30 minutes to do that, whatever. One of our tribal leaders, you know, went a little long, and it kind of bothered some people on the state side that spoke up. Hey, this isn't fair. You know, you're going over. And afterwards, you know, they pulled me aside and said, "Why did you let that happen? Why did you let that tribal leader go long?" And I'm like, one, that was an elder. I'm not going to cut off an elder. Okay, that's just not going to happen from my side. You know, we gave them the time limits. They're doing their best to work within it, and we'll trust them that they will. And if someone's going to go over, that's just life, you know. But approaching things and I don't want to sound cheesy, but approaching things in a good way is an important lesson to teach. And just that cultural, what you call it, propriety, how we treat elders, how we treat women, how we treat the chief executive versus the vice chair or the just regular council, and learning those differences. But those have been some challenges that we face, but I hopefully we're all trying to bring that together and get everybody on the same page.
Thank you, Dustin. I feel like the pattern there is education and learning from the three of you. And Sean, in your work, what have you found to be some of the biggest challenges, and how do you go about overcoming those?
Sure. Well, as was said earlier, and I just would reinforce it, coming from an industry perspective, industry's timelines aren't Indigenous timelines. There's a different way of going about building those relationships. Industry, you have shareholders and investors, and you need to have a regulatory filing on a project or something like that. That's great, but that might not line up with the timeline that it's going to take to get consent, to get that relationship established where a group of First Nations are able to support something. So you have to be patient about that. It's one thing that I've learned over my career as I've engaged from the industry side is kind of looking at how different, I'll call it, European culture is. I could walk into your office, Victoria, introduce myself, and suddenly we have a contract for a deal or something like that. Indigenous communities want to get to know you first and understand who you are. And then suddenly, at the right time, the door opens. But it takes that time and that patience to build that. And so, here in Canada, there's been a lot more deliberate push over the last few years about economic reconciliation being kind of a major lever. And whether I look at it from the industry side or, some of the First Nations who are building businesses, they're building that internal capacity so that they can take on that kind of meaningful work. And it's not what we've called up here check cutting exercises, where maybe it's a non-Indigenous company and they're paying a little bit of money to a band for some sort of a relationship, but it's not building their capacity. It's not building their labor force. It's not giving them the ability to really provide in a way that's meaningful for their community. And that just goes to another point that some of the others have made too, is, here in Alberta, there's dozens of First Nations communities. If there was only 8, it would make it a lot easier. But you can sometimes, I can have an Indigenous company doing work in one area, and that's not their traditional territory. So you have to finesse that a little bit too, because you can't always give work locally. But your intentions are in the right place, but you have to have that kind of communication and engagement going back and forth where you have those relationships and discussions. So, I mean, the biggest thing is it takes time. And if you're just doing something for a checklist so that you can file a regulatory application, you're not getting anywhere, because they'll sniff out whether you're genuine or not right off the bat.
Thank you, Sean. So it's time, patience, communication, learning, and educating. It seems like some of those strategies. Dustin, I'd like to learn more about the work that you do. I know that you obviously work at the education, at the college level, and also at the state agency. And so what strategies have you used to just enhance collaboration overall between tribal governments and the state of Utah?
I think our biggest push was, and going back to my previous answer, my biggest push is trying to get the state and non-Indian populations to see tribes as governments. I think sometimes we do just see them as community groups, a minority group in this area. And when you need a response from a government, sometimes it's not right away. It doesn't go It's not overnight, and sometimes the state will work on something for months and then say, we get tribes involved, see if they can answer us by Thursday. And it's like, whoa, you guys had this big, long process and these procedures that you had to follow. These tribal governments have these same processes and procedures. They have to vote on these things. They have to discuss these things. And depending on their constitutions, they might have to have a vote by referendum, involving everyone there, depending on the topic. So just getting people to understand that. And I think the way we've really tried to approach it is through communication. Our previous governor, Governor Gary Herbert, he instituted an executive order that required cabinet level state agencies to appoint a tribal liaison, someone in their department that looks for their counterpart in tribal governments and works directly with them. And so they're not, the tribe needs help with health and human services, they can call state health and human services, get in contact with their guy and start things going, but that takes training. We have to bring in these tribal liaisons from state agencies. We have to get them to a point where they feel comfortable in reaching out to different tribes and their different counterparts in these tribes. And sometimes we have to go with them to visit. And those initial introductions, just say, hey, Bob, this is Mary, she does the same thing you do on the tribal level. You guys should get to know each other type of deal. But this really, it really came out in a positive effect during COVID. When a lot of reservations, almost every reservation in Utah, at least, they shut down, they closed their borders, said no one comes in or out, but that limited their resources that they were able to obtain. It limited people going to work and things. But luckily, our Department of Health and Human Services tribal liaisons, our public safety tribal liaison, they were reaching right out to their contacts to each of these tribes and said, hey, how do we get food to you? How do we get water to you? How do we get PPE? How do we get testing equipment? All those things were just, those relationships were already established. And so it could work really fast. And it was just amazing to be a part of it. I kind of call it a COVID blessing. It showed us what we could do when we really need to. It showed us where we were at and where we could improve. Even we had during COVID, we had this huge windstorm that went through the Wasatch Front here, like Utah County and Salt Lake County, and took down like 10,000 trees. And this state and the cities were just they're chopping up, throwing in the landfills. And, these same people that we worked with said, hey, winter's coming up, we need firewood, so all these groups got together, they all chopped wood. We had UDOT with their connections with semi truck drivers. We had 88 trucks delivering firewood throughout the state, just because those relationships were established and those communications were established. But it's work, because there's turnover in tribal government, there's turnover in state government, and we have to keep training and we have to keep introducing people. And if we can keep people talking, it's really easy to have that good working relationship. A tribal leader said that. He said, he was like, it's hard to hate people when you face to face, because it's hard to hate face to face. So if we can get people in the same room and talking and discussing needs and how we can help each other out, it seems to work really well. And for COVID, it helped us. And with new Supreme Court cases that come out, like McGirt, or what was the other one, Castro Huerta, that came out, that talks about states having what do you call it, concurrent jurisdiction. When we're constantly talking, our tribal governments and state government can get together and say, hey, how are we going to work this out? This is a new Supreme Court case. How is this going to look in Utah? And making sure that communication takes place has been a really big blessing for us.
That's awesome. I think it speaks to the power of that relationship building aspect that is just so important here. We're gonna put up our second poll for our audience members. So, and it speaks to what Dustin was just talking about. What strategies do you use to enhance collaboration are you most interested in applying to your work? So is it integrating new technologies, building strong relationships, or establishing clear goals and objectives? And Naomi, I know you spoke a little bit earlier about some of the goals for the White House initiative. Can you speak to that a little bit more and how are they being achieved? What is the progress that's being made there?
Sure. So our White House initiative was created through an executive order 14049. It was signed by President Biden back in October 2021. It's very long, but we've kind of dwindled it down to some primary goals. The first one is education equity. So looking at systemic causes of education challenges facing our Native students, including barriers that prevent Native students access to higher education. So we really keep that at the center of the work that we do. But also most recently, President Biden signed Executive Order 14112, which was intended to increase accessibility and increase or decrease administrative burdens for tribes when they're applying for grants. And so what we've been doing is just leading the work in implementing that executive order. We're having a tribal consultation next week on that executive order. And also more recently, when schools were having problems accessing FAFSA, we were able to work with our department's financial student aid office and work with tribal colleges and universities to ensure that the financial aid leads had direct support with whatever they needed for getting FAFSA for our Native students. So that's just one way we worked on that. Another priority is data sovereignty, so supporting data collection related to Native students. Last year at the White House Tribal Nations Summit, I moderated a discussion with tribal leaders and Secretary Miguel Cardona, where data sovereignty was a consistent concern from tribal leaders. At the end of that conversation, the secretary committed the department to having a tribal consultation on data. And so leading up to that consultation earlier this year, the White House Initiative participated in a listening session with our other federal colleagues at the National Indian Education Association's conference here in DC. And we just recently held a tribal consultation a few months ago on that to really start working internally in letting our ed colleagues know the data sovereignty piece, but then also getting input externally. Another piece we worked on was high quality education. So increasing our Native students' participation in high quality early education programs, promoting evidence-based practices, and helping get our students into safe and healthy communities and learning communities. So we support our Native American Teacher Retention Initiative grantees. That's a grant through our Office of Indian Education. And we also just help support our Office of Civil Rights. Local education agencies, state education agencies, and even tribal are able to work with our Office of Civil Rights to just make note of unhealthy environments. And so we've been working with our Office of Civil Rights to ensure that we can let our tribal leaders know about those resources as well. We also work on interagency work. So we had a convening last October with Department of Labor where we had an all-day event with federal employees to really discuss ways in which we can better create outreach opportunities for federal agencies, but also how can we look at what we are doing internally through our grants or through our outreach efforts, and how can we make sure that our Native communities get those opportunities. A discussion I like to highlight out of that is one specifically related to disabilities. In a roundtable discussion, we were talking about just even in our tribal languages, like we don't have a word for disabilities. It's more or less just seen as how can we help this member of our community get accommodated so they can be equal to us. It's not seen as like a deficit. And so that was also something for our non-Native federal employees to really think about in an Indigenous aspect of our community space. Like, how can they also understand that on the federal level, but make that connection as well? We also do promoting outreach, promoting student well-being. So looking at post-COVID-19 pandemic, how did that impact our students' social, emotional, mental health? We help lead our tribal consultation and career building, and also support incorporating Native traditions into education. That's also with our supporting Native languages in education. October 7th and 8th, we'll have a Native Language Summit in Palm Springs. So we've been working on that. And then the last point we focus on is excellence. So promoting student teachers, professionals who all support our Native students. A few months ago, or last month, I attended an inaugural Eloise Cobell Dissertation Writing Year Fellowship, which was the first year that the Cobell Scholarship Fund funded Native PhD students a year for them to write their dissertations. And those students were really incredible. They were studying anything from marine biology to Native languages to other areas. And it was really great to see that as well.
Thank you, Naomi. I think it's inspiring how far-reaching some of those projects are and how that connects to the work that Dustin's doing at the state level in Utah. For Burke and Sean, I know that you all both focused on the energy industry, and so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how the space of tribal and Indigenous affairs is unique to this space. So what strategies do you use? What is it like day to day? Let's start with Burke.
Yes, ma'am. The relationship between the tribes and the oil and gas companies here, whether it be Chesapeake size, BP, you get the Exxon Mobil, those size companies, and the mom and pop size companies, the relationships between the tribes and those two sets of companies has been very strained over the years. We're in the process of recovering severance tax that wasn't paid to us on our tribal assets that we have mineral interests in and surface interests. Delinquent severance tax is due to us on a lot of different fronts. We're going after that, and it's a different day for the oil companies to have somebody like myself sitting on the other side of the table that understands all of the acronyms, all of the definitions of operations and what's going on operations-wise in the field, accounting for natural gas that's sold, accounting for crude oil from the field to the LAC units or the liquid and custody transfer units. That tells the story on what you've got coming to you for your compensation. We haven't had that before. And the scope of that is changing, not only with the Kiowas, but the Osages, the Otomizuras, the Comanches are all starting to see that we've been holding the short end of the stick. So now that we're turning over these stones to let them know that we understand the process, because people like myself coming from a long background in this are starting to hold them accountable for the things that they have not done and the payments that they have not made. That's one thing that's changing between the tribes and the oil companies. There's a lot of positives coming to the native tribes from this. Third taxation processes. We're moving in a direction to where any third-party activities in support of drilling or production are going to be taxed by our tribes. And that's going to be another way of bringing money in that we need for our tribal operations. But for us, it's going in a very positive direction. For the oil companies, not so positive a direction. But it's something that they're responsible for by treaty, by contracts that are in place. And I don't know how they've slid into the cracks over the years, but it's uncovered and at the forefront of our business right now. And the thing that I'm doing with the orphan oil and gas wells has exposed a lot of this stuff. When we look at the marginally producing wells, the wells that are not producing at all, the wells that are abandoned and orphaned, it's a whole ball of wax that's coming undone.
Thank you, Burke. And I definitely appreciate all the expertise that you're bringing to the tribal side of it. Sean, can you talk to us a little bit more about your perspective and how you're navigating the oil and energy industry with Indigenous affairs?
Sure. Well, one of the things that's a little bit different than what Burke just talked about was here the agreements and the treaties are between the federal government and the nations. So if a company wants to build a major project or a pipeline or things like that, the federal government takes the payments. The federal government gives the regulatory approvals. You still are consulting with the nations, and sometimes, nations will use those industry projects as leverage to try and get movement from the federal government on certain things. But, there's been a lot of lawsuits up here that have shown that our federal governments, and it's of both major parties, haven't honored treaty obligations, haven't followed through on commitments. And so there's large financial settlements that go with that because, they're supposed to be stewards of the money that they collect on behalf of the nations. But there's been a lot of lawsuits that have shown that that follow through hasn't happened. So it does and this is a personal frustration. I'm not speaking on behalf of any company, but is too often that federal government bureaucracy gets in the way of some of those discussions that can happen between the proponent of something and and that nation. Each nation has their own unique considerations, their own things that they might want to negotiate, their own local, sensitivities and things that you need to take into account, not to mention their own cultural practices. So it becomes hard at points to have some of those direct discussions, or to get the kinds of agreements that are going to help create benefits for both parties. And, like one of the other things is sometimes you have like these major projects that come in and, you know, Burke will have seen this as well. Um, you know, they have larger budgets than the normal operating assets do. And so they can come in and, put money towards an arena or something like that that's a local priority. But then when it gets turned over to the operation side of the business, their budget is a fraction of that. And suddenly it looks like you're not being generous or you're not being a good neighbor when the budget on it is very small. Just as a nature of how it goes. So like I said at the beginning, like I try to figure out ways where you can have those discussions between a company, an organization, and that First Nation, so that you can identify like what is important for them, what are the priorities, and you have to recognize that, you know, one band, one nation that's in a geographic location, you could have another one a couple hundred miles, a couple hundred kilometers away, and they're going to have very different interests and needs, and you may have to go through a very different process.
Thank you, Sean, and I definitely appreciate you bringing in perspective from Canada and their different policies that they have over there. I want to open up our chat for Q&A. So if any of our audience members have any questions that they'd like for our panelists to answer, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A and we will get to them. But I also want to look at the results from our second poll. So the question was, what strategies to enhance collaboration are you most interested in applying to your work? And it looks like the number one answer was building strong relationships, which I think all of our panelists have spoken to. And that's something that we all kind of hold near and dear to our hearts and know that is so important. The second answer was integrating new technologies, and I can see how that can also go hand in hand with building strong relationships. And then our final answer was establishing clear goals and objectives. So keep the answers coming as we continue to do polls and continue to drop questions into the Q&A chat. So this actually speaks to some of the poll questions that we had right there. But Sarah has the question: in the virtual environment, what is the best way to build those relationships? And I'll open this up to any of our panelists to answer if they have any experience in building relationships in our current digital world.
I'll take that question. I'll tell you what, the world of Zoom and Microsoft Teams meetings has facilitated meeting a lot of people. And if I'm going to let's just say that a grant is opened up for oil and gas activities, you have a lot of participants there that you can take note of who's in the room. And if they're in your area, I found myself reaching out to them in collaboration to make sure that we all understand the definition of the program, how transparent it needs to be, what it's going to take to qualify for the grant. And this modern way of reaching out like that has helped a lot in collaborations. I've met a lot of people that I would have never met before just because of that.
Definitely, it's incredible how it can kind of cross barriers and regional divides. Does anyone else want to chime in there?
Yeah, just building off of what Brooke said, it doesn't replace that personal interaction, and that's the key to the foundation of those relationships. Sometimes we become too reliant on that technology, and one of my mentors said to me, even if you're not living in that particular area and you're doing work in there, you need to put in that time at that local level, going to their weekly field hockey game, or stuff like that, because once you've built those relationships, you can draw on some of these other tools too for those quicker interactions, or to, hey, by the way, this is just happening, but you still have to build those personal one-on-one relationships.
Thank you, Sean. Our next question comes from Sean and Aya. It was mentioned that agencies have tribal liaisons should form relationships with tribes. What is the best way for liaisons to reach out, and how should they introduce themselves? I believe, Dustin, you spoke to this, so you can chime in there about that.
Oh, we just, we do it a couple different ways. Part of what we do is we have Utah tribal leader meetings that are every other month. So 6 times a year, we'll have state agencies just report on what they're doing to tribal leaders. Each of the 8 tribes in Utah, they will designate a person from their council to sit on this committee, and so it provides a good foot in the door on a lot of things. So you can come and say, hey, I'm with economic development, and this is my job, and I'd like to work more with you and your tribe, and see how we can form partnerships. And I'll be reaching out to you all in the next couple of weeks. Is there someone in particular I should be asking for, or a phone number I should be calling? And usually they'll get those answers right there. And then if they're still a little hesitant, we'll drive out there. My division has a cultural liaison, and it's not me, but it's another guy from Canada. So it's like Calgary. And he's really good about saying, hey, this is how you introduce yourself. This is, he'll even provide like sage or cedar and as gifts, or tobacco when we get there. Just say, hey, just hand this to them, and they'll shake your hand for it, and just getting them used to some certain protocols like that. And so those Utah tribal leader meetings help doing that. We also set up individual meetings with the governor and the tribes. And we invite all the tribal liaisons to attend those meetings, just because the governor is not going to know all the answers. But if someone from all these agencies are there, they can say, hey, this is me. I'm from that division. I'd be happy to reach out to you and come and see you after that. Or right after this meeting, we can step outside and talk. That seems to work the best. It makes you have to make a little more effort to do it, but it pays dividends. And echoing what everyone's saying, taking part in tribal celebrations and their community celebrations, it's not always business. My office, we try to set up an info booth at every powwow. If there's a tribal powwow, we have an info booth with a QR code and some flyers on what we can do. Luckily, a few of us are, we dance or we sing in these local powwows or these local celebrations. So we meet other people in that way. But just getting out there and being a part of it and showing your face and in a scene where that's outside of what your job would require, it goes miles, and just being personable really helps.
Thank you. That's very helpful and very tangible as well. Naomi, do you also have any experience with that in terms of facilitating those federal liaison and tribal nation relationships, and how do you go about those?
Yeah, I think things that Dustin mentioned are all really great. Another I guess point that I always bring up on the federal level to some of my federal colleagues is that when you do go into these meetings, think of it as you are representing the whatever government or office, but that is the interaction that tribe is going to have. The interaction, good or bad, that's what you're representing. You're not representing like yourself. It's more of like they see you as the federal government. So if they do bring up something, like there has to be a level of reciprocated respect in those conversations as well. And I think that coming into those discussions with respect, I always like to kind of put it as an analogy of like you are representative, like going to the UN, and you are representing the US to another country. And in the sense, it's a separate sovereign nation. So like you're essentially doing that, so that level of respect needs to be given in the moment as well. I also appreciate too, even on my internal federal meetings, when some of my colleagues acknowledge that they may not know much. At the very top of the meeting, they'll be like, this is my first or second meeting that I've had. I don't have experience working with tribes. Please tell me if there is anything that I am doing that is not culturally respected, or I'm open to hearing that. Like that at the very beginning is always helpful, because then that also allows me to tell them more about my culture. And then kind of what Dustin mentioned about the giving of tobacco, like for my tribe, it's actually really impolite to look at somebody in the eye the entire time they're talking. And so culturally, our elders don't look at you when you're talking, because we're taught to listen. And so on the other side of things, in like the broader perspective, is like it looks like they're ignoring you, and it's like, no, they're actually, that's the sign of respect. Like they're actually listening to you. And so I think understanding that there are other cultural nuances for each tribe that you may not see in the majority of the US as being disrespectful could be interpreted that way too. So just be mindful of that when you're having those discussions. I know when I go home, I have to remember that too. Like, oh yeah, I gotta respect my elders, don't stare at them when they're talking, or like do different things like that. So there are going to be like other nuances like that you'll run into.
Definitely. And then as we answer some of our last Q&A questions from our audience, I want to also give them the opportunity to answer their last poll. So the last question is going to be, what excites you most about the future of tribal affairs? Is it collaborative partnerships, advancing new technology, or increasing tribal sovereignty? And so this question is to Naomi again from Anthony. In addition to the language example that you mentioned, are there other data challenges that hinder the federal, state, and local tribal relations? And if so, what might they be?
There actually was a report. I'm going to get really nerdy. I'm going to just preface that. There was a report that came out earlier this year. It's called the Indigenous Student Count. And it goes over 2 different programs that are available to public schools, Native American students. But they are, the population is the Native students in public schools, but they are placed in 2 different agencies and have 2 different forms of what qualifies as a Native student. And so because of that, there is a big undercount and miscount of data. It's also a big subsection in the Broken Promises report that was recorded by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights back in 2018, Chapter 4, I think it is, where they talk about the undercount of Native students. That's the hard part about it, is depending on your Native student status as an enrolled member, tribal member, or an affiliated tribe, there are so many different layers to enrollment that get kind of swept up into that student count and data piece, that it does make it very complicated. It gets even more complicated in the sense that there are federal laws that state that tribes do not have access to that data. And so the other converse of that is what tribes are collecting that student data, and are they doing it on their own? Because on the local level, you would be violating a federal law. So there's a lot of different layers involved in education. But I will say the bright spot, or the good news, is that the White House Office of Management and Budget released the SDP 15, and don't quote me on what that acronym stands for. I know I'm going to get very DC, but if you look it up, they just revised that. So it looks at the racial classifications and really focuses on American Indian, Alaska Native. And so agencies are now given up to 2029 to look at their current practices and revise that. So that work is currently beginning. And so we've been working with some colleagues on what does that mean for the Department of Education? What does that mean for our student count data? So the good news of it is, there are some ways to really get involved and get input on that. The bad news is that it's taken this long to kind of happen. So there's a lot of data issues. I should just say that.
Yeah, but that added information is very helpful. And from Jennifer, we have a question about, have you ever met someone who you didn't hit it off with but needed to work with? How did you recover? How did you build if they don't understand or respect your position or your tribe's position? So this question can be answered by anyone, but really the core is, how do you recover when you might have a misstep?
I'll answer that. I'm coming from a job where I was a manager for health, safety, and environmental, and had to do a lot of safety meetings and address some stuff that, some of it was like an elephant in the room. Some of it was very personal problems. But having made missteps with individuals or with executives in the early part of my career, was overcome by letting them know how sincere I was in trying to do something correctly. And letting them know that if it was a misstep, it was inadvertent, and that I'm trying to do the best job that I can to make sure everybody's safe. And I used to use the term, I want you to go home just like you came into work, in one piece. So if I make any mistakes in trying to complete that task, I apologize for it, but understand that my heart is in the right place. And if I stepped on your toes or did something that you don't agree with, just bear with me. You don't have to dislike me. You can dislike the way I do things, but just understand that my heart is in the right place and sincerity is there. So that helped me repair a lot of bad dealings, and it helped me move forward with making new relationships.
Thank you, Burke. And that speaks to the power of being able to recover and then look forward to the future. So for our last question, we're going to be focusing on the future and the next steps of tribal affairs. So if you could describe the future of tribal affairs and relations in one word, what would it be? And as you all are answering that, I also want to bring attention to our poll. So our audience was asking or answering what excites them most about the future of tribal affairs, and the number one answer is collaborative partnerships, which is something that has definitely come up a lot in our conversation today. Number two is increasing tribal sovereignty, and then the last one is advancing new technologies. So now to our panelists, what is most exciting about the future, and if you could describe it in one word, what would it be? Let's start with Dustin.
the most exciting thing in one word, work. It's gonna be a lot of work. You know, we have a long way to go. We're doing a lot of things right, but we have a long way to go. Like Burke said, you know, you're gonna make mistakes. Both sides are gonna make mistakes. And I just, you know, I tell my office sometimes we're going to be apologizing for things that maybe you don't think we need to be apologizing for. But if it helps us move forward, if it shows, you know, a little bit of humility and that we're trying to move forward in the right way, and you know, it's worth it. You know, it's worth saying to tribal leaders, hey, we're giving this a shot. It didn't work out. We're going to try again. If you know a better way to do it, please tell us. You know, we're trying to make this as beneficial to both sides as we can. But it has to happen. You know, the state's not going anywhere. And the tribes aren't either. You know, the tribes are there. They're home now, and they have their government set up, and they're not going to let it go. They're not going to release it and give it away. So you have to figure out a way to work together. So but I'm excited about that. You know, it's work, and it's going to take everyone's hands in the mix to get it done.
It's hard work, but it's exciting. Sean, if you could describe it in one word, what would it be?
Progress would be the word I would look at. You know, you look at the partnerships, and you know, if you've got people on both sides who are willing to look at something and not just say this is the way it's always been, but what do we need to do to get things done? There's a lot more people coming to the table with those kinds of intentions, because, you know, we're tired of seeing the same kind of hamster wheel of problems, and we want to see better things happening in Indigenous communities, and we want to see this economic reconciliation be a way to leverage, you know, a better future for all of us. And so for me, it's really looking at that, you know, as making progress, and like, you know, Dustin said, it's going to take a lot of work, and it will take a lot of engagement and looking at things in different ways to make it all happen.
Thank you, Sean. Burke, what's one word to describe the future of this space?
The thing that I have on my heart about everything that I do is success. I want to whenever I walk into a room and I start to engage anybody, I want them to see success on me from top to bottom, no matter how tough the task may be, how long a time frame it may take to get to the end. The one thing that I never want anybody that's involved with me to entertain is it not working or it not being a success. And I feel like if I keep that right here on my shoulder, and you see that in my actions, it's contagious. I think that, you know, when a person wakes up and comes into the office in the morning who doesn't really have their heart in it, and they see me walk through the door and I'm ready to knock a wall down and solve a problem, or look at a budget, go in the field, have a problem with a lease operator, anything that I do, if I keep success at the forefront of everything, from attitude to my exchange with people, I think that's where I'm going to be with the BIA, Department of Energy, BLM, Oklahoma Corporation Commission. There's never going to be a time whenever they don't see anything but the best from me.
That's beautiful, and it definitely shines through. And Naomi, what about you? What is one word to describe the future of tribal affairs?
I was thinking about unifying, and I only mention that because back during the pandemic, I previously worked in Congress during COVID, and that's the first time I was able to honestly say that tribes all had the same requests. And we had a Congress that heard that and did something with it. And so that unifying nature and that unified message is what I see the future as being. Because when we came together like that in the tribal sense, and Congress was able to answer that, I think the more we do that unification in the tribal aspect, but even at all these different government aspects, the more we can get things done.
Thank you, Naomi, and it's powerful working together. Well, that's all we have for today. I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing all of our insights and experiences with us. I also want to thank our audience for all their participation throughout. And please keep an eye out for any future webinars that we might have. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.